The air grows still in the forests of northeastern Arizona on certain nights, as if the trees themselves are holding their breath, waiting. Local residents have learned to recognize this silence, this heaviness that settles over the pines like an invisible blanket. It's the same silence that fell on November 5th, 1975, moments before 7 men's lives changed forever. What happened to Travis Walton during those 5 missing days has been debated, analyzed, and scrutinized for nearly 5 decades. But the real story, the one that emerges when you look past the sensational headlines and Hollywood dramatizations, reveals something far more profound about human consciousness, the nature of reality itself, and what it truly means to survive an encounter with the unknown. Most people know the basic outline of the Travis Walton case. A young logger struck by a beam of light from an unidentified craft vanishes for 5 days while his terrified co-workers flee in panic, only to return confused and traumatized with fragmented memories of sterile rooms and strange beings. It's become one of the most famous alleged alien abduction cases in history, inspiring books, documentaries, and a major Hollywood film. But what gets lost in the retelling, what slips through the cracks of sensationalized accounts, is the deeper transformation that occurred, not just to Travis Walton, the man, but to everyone who came into contact with this event. The real story isn't about proving aliens exist or debunking a hoax. It's about what happens to a human being when the foundational assumptions of their reality shatter in an instant, and how they rebuild themselves in the aftermath. Understanding Travis Walton's experience requires us to step back from our preconceptions about alien encounters and consider something more fundamental. What does it mean to have your reality completely upended? What happens to the human psyche when it confronts something so far outside its frame of reference that language itself becomes inadequate? These questions matter because Travis Walton's story isn't just his own. It's a mirror reflecting something profound about the human condition, about the boundaries of our understanding, and about the courage it takes to stand in your truth when the entire world demands you recant.
The events of that November evening unfolded in a way that seems almost scripted in retrospect, as if the universe was setting the stage for something momentous. 7 men, exhausted from a day of logging work, bouncing along a rutted forest road in a pickup truck, their minds on dinner and rest. The conversation was ordinary, the kind of casual banter that working men share after hours of physical labor. Then came the light. Not a gentle glow building gradually in the distance, but a sudden, impossible radiance that seemed to tear through the fabric of the forest itself. The truck rounded a bend, and there it was, hovering above a clearing like something that had stepped out of a dream or a nightmare. The descriptions from that night are remarkably consistent across all 7 witnesses. A disc-shaped object, approximately 30 feet across and 15 feet high, suspended in the air with no visible means of support. The light it emitted wasn't like anything produced by human technology. It had qualities that seemed to defy the normal behavior of light itself. Simultaneously soft and piercing, golden but tinged with electric blue, creating shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't move. What makes the Travis Walton case so compelling isn't just the initial sighting, though that alone would be remarkable. It's what happened next, and more importantly, what happened over the following days and years. When Travis Walton jumped out of that truck and approached the hovering craft, he wasn't acting with the calculated bravery of a hero in a movie. Those who knew him describe a man who lived on instinct, whose restless energy often propelled him forward before his conscious mind could fully process the consequences. In that moment, something deeper than curiosity was at work. Those who've studied the case extensively, including psychologists and researchers who've interviewed Walton countless times, suggest that what drew him forward wasn't recklessness, but a kind of primal recognition, as if some part of his consciousness understood that this moment was meant to happen, that he was being called.
The beam of light that struck Travis Walton wasn't merely a physical phenomenon. Every witness described the same sequence.
Travis standing beneath the craft, looking up, his body language suggesting both awe and confusion. Then the beam, a concentrated shaft of bluish-green light that seemed almost solid, reaching down from the underside of the object and hitting him square in the chest. The witnesses describe his body lifting off the ground, arms and legs splaying outward, suspended for a moment in a pose that suggested both agony and surprise before being thrown backward with tremendous force. The way they describe it, it wasn't like being struck by lightning or hit by a projectile. It was as if the beam contained properties that interacted with the fundamental structure of matter itself. As if for a brief moment Travis Walton existed between states, neither fully present nor fully absent. The panic that seized the remaining 6 men in that truck was primal and absolute. Mike Rogers, who had known Travis for years, who trusted him like a brother, slammed his foot on the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. They tore through the forest, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle, none of them speaking, because what words could possibly contain what they had just witnessed? The human mind has limits to what it can process in moments of extreme stress. These men, practical individuals whose lives revolved around the tangible realities of logging work, had just watched their friend struck down by something that shouldn't exist. Their reaction, fleeing in terror, has been used by skeptics to suggest guilt or conspiracy. But anyone who's experienced genuine existential fear understands that flight response. It's not cowardice. It's the most honest reaction a human being can have when confronted with something so far outside the boundaries of normal experience that survival instinct overrides everything else. The decision to turn back, to return to the clearing despite their terror, speaks to something profound about human nature. Guilt and loyalty proved stronger than fear. They drove back along that same rutted road, hearts pounding, hands shaking, expecting at any moment to see that light again, to be taken themselves. But when they reached the clearing, it was empty. The craft was gone, the light had vanished, and Travis Walton had disappeared as if he'd never existed. They searched frantically, calling his name into the darkness, flashlight beams cutting through the underbrush, hoping desperately that he'd step out from behind a tree with some explanation, even an impossible one. But the forest offered only silence, the kind of heavy, watchful silence that makes you feel observed even when you can see nothing watching.
What happened during those 5 days remains the central mystery of the Travis Walton case. His fragmented memories, pieced together slowly in the aftermath of his return, paint a picture that's both terrifyingly alien and strangely familiar to anyone who studied the broader phenomenon of alleged alien encounters. He describes waking in what felt like a medical examination room, the walls curved and metallic, the light coming from no discernible source but seeming to emanate from the very structure itself. The air was wrong, he would later say. Not unbreathable, but dense, heavy with something he couldn't identify, as if it carried properties beyond simple oxygen and nitrogen. His body felt strange, disconnected, as though he was experiencing it from a slight distance, present but not fully integrated. The beings he encountered in that initial room have become iconic in UFO literature, but the reality of confronting them, according to Travis, was far more unsettling than any description can convey. They were small, roughly 5 feet tall, with bodies that seemed almost fragile, childlike in their proportions, but moving with a fluid precision that suggested anything but weakness. Their skin was pale, not the gray often depicted in popular culture, but something closer to cream or ivory, smooth and hairless. But it was the eyes that dominated their faces, enormous and dark, taking up perhaps a third of the available surface area, tilted slightly upward at the outer corners. Those eyes, Travis would later recount, contained no emotion that he could read, no warmth or hostility, just an intent focus that made him feel utterly transparent, as if every thought, every memory, every aspect of his being was instantly accessible to them. The examination, if that's what it was, proceeded without words. Travis describes trying to communicate, his voice hoarse and desperate, asking where he was, demanding to be released, but receiving no verbal response. Instead, he felt sensations, impressions that arrived in his mind without passing through his ears. Not thoughts exactly, but something between emotion and concept, a kind of direct transmission that bypassed language entirely. The being seemed to be studying him with the detached curiosity of scientists observing a specimen, not cruel but not particularly concerned with his comfort or consent either. They moved around him with coordinated precision, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested either long practice or some form of shared consciousness.
When Travis panicked and lashed out, grabbing what he described as a metal rod from a nearby surface and swinging it wildly to keep the beings at bay, their reaction was telling. They didn't restrain him forcibly or respond with aggression. They simply withdrew, stepping back through a doorway and disappearing into the corridor beyond, leaving him alone in that sterile room. This detail, often overlooked in sensationalized retellings, suggests something important about the nature of the encounter. These beings, whatever they were, weren't behaving like invaders or torturers. Their retreat in the face of his fear and aggression suggests a kind of ethical boundary, a recognition that forcing the interaction would serve no purpose. Or perhaps they simply found his terror uninteresting, a variable that complicated their study. The corridor Travis found himself in after leaving that first room has become another iconic element of his account. Long, curving, lined with doors that opened onto spaces he couldn't fully comprehend. Some rooms contained equipment that glowed and pulsed with inner light. Others held what looked like viewing screens or windows showing scenes he couldn't place, landscapes that might have been alien worlds or might have been Earth seen from impossible angles. The entire craft, from his descriptions, seemed to operate on principles that defied conventional physics. There were no visible seams in the walls, no obvious power sources, no mechanical components he could identify. Everything felt organic somehow, as if the ship itself was alive, responding to presence and intention rather than switches and controls. The encounter with the human-looking figure remains one of the most controversial aspects of Travis Walton's account. After wandering the corridors of what he believed was the alien craft, he entered a large domed chamber containing a central chair positioned before a curved viewport displaying a breathtaking vista of stars. As he approached this chair, drawn by curiosity and desperate hope that it might offer some means of communication or escape, another figure entered the room. This being looked human, or close enough that Travis felt a surge of relief. Tall, with blonde hair and tan skin, wearing a fit-fitting uniform that seemed to shimmer subtly in the ambient light. But something about this figure was off, too. Too perfect somehow. The proportions just slightly idealized, the movements too graceful. When this being smiled at Travis, the expression held reassurance but lacked the complex spontaneity of genuine human emotion. The question of who or what this human-looking figure was has spawned countless theories. Some researchers suggest these beings represent a different species entirely, perhaps more closely related to humans, or further along an evolutionary path we're only beginning to travel. Others propose they might be hybrids, created by the smaller beings for purposes we can't fathom. Still others, approaching the phenomenon from more esoteric angles, suggest these human-looking entities might represent something even stranger, perhaps existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously or serving as interfaces between radically different forms of consciousness. Travis himself has never claimed to understand what this being was. He only knows that its presence calmed him, that it seemed to communicate safety even without words, and that he felt compelled to follow it deeper into the craft. What happened in the final chamber Travis remembers is perhaps the most fragmentary and disturbing part of his recollection. More human-looking beings waited there, all with that same too-perfect quality, their features symmetrical in ways that felt subtly wrong. They guided him, not forcefully but insistently, to what resembled an examination table. When he resisted weakly, exhausted and overwhelmed, they didn't force him, but their coordinated movements left little room for refusal. A mask descended toward his face, clear material filled with swirling mist, and despite his attempts to turn away, his strength failed. Darkness claimed him, not the clean darkness of sleep, but something heavier, more absolute, as if consciousness itself was being switched off at some fundamental level. His next memory is waking on cold ground, pine needles pressed against his cheek, the smell of earth and bark filling his lungs. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't place where he was or even who he was. The transition from that sterile, impossible environment to the familiar reality of an Arizona forest was so jarring that his mind struggled to process it. Above him, barely visible through the canopy of trees, a light hovered, soft, white, pulsing once like a heartbeat before shooting upward into the darkness with impossible speed and vanishing as if it had never existed. That image, that final glimpse of the light ascending, would replay in his mind for decades, a parting message or farewell that left him simultaneously abandoned and released.
The 5 days that passed for everyone else had felt like mere hours to Travis, maybe less. Time inside that craft operated according to different rules, or his memory had compressed or expanded the experience in ways he couldn't untangle. When he finally made his way to a gas station and called his brother Grant, his voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and broken, struggling to form coherent words. The man who stumbled into his brother's arms that night was fundamentally changed, not just physically exhausted and dehydrated, but altered at some deeper level, as if the experience had rewritten portions of his essential code. The skepticism Travis faced upon his return was perhaps as traumatic as the experience itself. Being struck by an alien beam of light and taken aboard a craft is one kind of violation. Having your truth dismissed, your sanity questioned, your motives impugned by people who weren't there and couldn't possibly understand, that's another kind of violation entirely. The investigation that followed treated him and his co-workers as suspects in a potential murder rather than witnesses to an extraordinary event. The logic was understandable from a conventional perspective. A man disappears after his friends claim they saw him struck by a beam from a flying saucer. The simpler explanation is that the man was killed, accidentally or intentionally, and the UFO story was concocted to cover up the crime. The fact that this explanation requires Travis's 6 co-workers to coordinate a complex lie and maintain it under repeated interrogation, polygraph examinations, and media scrutiny apparently seemed more plausible to investigators than the possibility that something genuinely anomalous had occurred. The polygraph tests administered to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew became a crucial element in the case. 6 of the 7 men passed examinations indicating they were telling the truth about witnessing a UFO and seeing Travis struck by a beam of light. One test came back inconclusive, neither definitively indicating deception nor truth. For those inclined to believe the account, these results offered powerful validation. For skeptics, they provided ammunition for doubt. Polygraph tests, after all, measure physiological responses to stress, not objective truth. A person who believes something false can pass a polygraph if they genuinely believe it. A person telling the truth can fail if they're anxious or feel guilty about something unrelated. The tests, in other words, measure conviction more than fact. But the consistency with which these men passed, combined with the consistency of their individual accounts, suggested something more than shared delusion or coordinated deception. Travis himself underwent extensive psychological evaluation upon his return. Doctors found him coherent and stable, showing signs of exhaustion and mild dehydration, but no evidence of psychosis, drug use, or neurological damage that might explain his account as hallucination or mental breakdown. His memory of the missing days was fragmentary, arriving in flashes and pieces rather than as a coherent narrative, which actually lends credibility to his account. False memories constructed after the fact tend to be more complete and detailed than genuine traumatic memories, which often exist in fragments precisely because the mind couldn't fully process them in real time. The clinical assessment essentially concluded that whatever Travis believed had happened to him, he wasn't lying about his beliefs, and he wasn't demonstrably insane. The impact of the Hollywood film Fire in the Sky on public perception of the Travis Walton case cannot be overstated. Released in 1993, the movie took significant creative liberties with the events, particularly the scenes depicting Travis's time aboard the craft. The film portrayed his experience as far more grotesque and horrifying than his actual account, adding elements of body horror and visceral terror that made for compelling cinema but distorted the reality of what he claims to have experienced. Travis himself has been vocal about these departures from his actual memories. The real experience, he maintains, was clinical and strange rather than overtly terrifying. The beings weren't malicious or sadistic, they were detached, methodical, engaged in something that felt more like scientific study than torture. The fear came from the profound alienness of it all, from being utterly powerless in an environment that operated according to rules he couldn't understand, not from deliberate cruelty. This distinction matters because it reveals something important about how we process and communicate encounters with the unknown. The Hollywood version gives us monsters we can understand, evil we can identify and oppose. The reality Travis describes is more unsettling precisely because it doesn't fit those comfortable categories. The beings weren't good or evil in human terms, they simply were, operating according to their own logic and purposes, indifferent to his terror in the way a biologist might be indifferent to the distress of a captured animal being tagged and studied. That kind of cosmic indifference is harder for us to process than outright malevolence. It suggests a universe where human concepts of right and wrong, consent and violation might be parochial concerns limited to our species and irrelevant to others. The question of why Travis Walton, why that particular crew on that particular night in that particular clearing, has no satisfying answer. Some researchers point to the forest itself, to reports of unusual phenomena in that region stretching back decades. Others suggest the logging contract the crew was working might have brought them to a location where something else was already occurring, making Travis an accidental witness who got too close. Still others, diving into more speculative territory, propose that Travis was somehow selected, that his presence at that moment wasn't random, but orchestrated by intelligences capable of manipulating circumstances across vast distances of space and time. Travis himself has no answer to the why question. He was just a young man doing his job, living his life, with no particular interest in UFOs or extraterrestrial life before that night. The randomness of it, the apparent meaninglessness, is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. There's no protection in skepticism or ignorance, no way to opt out of an encounter with the unknown. The aftermath of the Travis Walton incident reveals patterns that echo through numerous similar cases. The experiencer returns fundamentally changed, not just psychologically, but in ways that resist easy categorization. Travis describes heightened sensitivity to certain frequencies and lights, a sense of presence or awareness that persists even decades later, dreams that feel more like memories than unconscious constructions. These aren't the symptoms of trauma in the conventional sense, though trauma is certainly part of the picture. They're markers of someone whose consciousness has been altered by contact with something radically other, someone who's glimpsed dimensions of reality that most people never encounter and can safely ignore. That glimpse, once seen, cannot be unseen. The membrane between the everyday world and the larger reality surrounding it becomes permanently thinner for those who've passed through experiences like Travis's. The community of experiencers that Travis became part of after going public with his story represents a fascinating subculture that exists largely outside mainstream awareness. These are people from all walks of life, teachers and truck drivers, nurses and engineers, who share the common thread of having encountered something that shattered their previous understanding of reality. They find each other through conferences, support groups, online forums, drawn together by a need for understanding and validation that the broader culture cannot provide. What's striking about this community is not just the similarity of their experiences, though the patterns are remarkable, but the similar ways these experiences transform them. Many report becoming more intuitive, more attuned to subtle energies and emotional currents in people and places. Many describe technology behaving strangely around them, electronics malfunctioning or responding in unexpected ways. Many struggle with the isolation of carrying knowledge that cannot be communicated effectively to those who haven't shared similar experiences. Travis Walton's role in this community has been that of an elder statesman, someone whose case achieved enough prominence that he could speak publicly without being immediately dismissed as delusional. But the prominence came at a cost. His life was disrupted in ways that went far beyond the immediate trauma of the experience itself. Relationships strained under the weight of his story. Employment became complicated when potential employers Googled his name. The constant retelling of his account, necessary to keep the truth alive but exhausting in its repetition, took its toll. He watched as others monetized or sensationalized his experience, as documentaries and books used his story to promote agendas he didn't necessarily support. The burden of being a public experiencer, of having your most profound and personal trauma become public property, is something few people can truly understand. Yet through it all, Travis never recanted. He never added sensational new details to make his story more marketable. He never claimed to have cosmic answers or special knowledge granted by his abductors. His consistency over decades, his refusal to embellish or profit excessively from his experience, lends weight to his account in ways that more dramatic stories often undermine themselves. He presents as a man who simply wants to be believed about something that happened to him, not as a prophet or guru seeking followers. That humility, that grounded quality, makes him a compelling witness precisely because he doesn't fit the profile of someone seeking attention or constructing an elaborate hoax.
The scientific investigation of the Travis Walton case has been complicated by the nature of the evidence. There are no physical artifacts from the craft, no alien tissues or technology left behind. The physical evidence consists primarily of the testimony of 8 men, the results of psychological and polygraph examinations, and the documented search efforts that found no trace of Travis during those 5 days. Some researchers reported elevated radiation levels at the site where Travis was allegedly struck by the beam, though these findings remain disputed and difficult to verify decades after the fact. Others noted unusual tree growth patterns in the clearing, a radial arrangement that some interpret as evidence of exposure to unconventional energy sources. But none of this constitutes proof in the scientific sense, the kind of repeatable, falsifiable evidence that would satisfy skeptics or convert the investigation from marginal to mainstream. This evidentiary problem cuts to the heart of why the UFO phenomenon remains controversial despite thousands of reported encounters. The experiences are inherently subjective, occurring to individuals or small groups, often in isolated locations, leaving little in the way of physical evidence that survives long enough to be rigorously examined. The beings or intelligences behind these encounters, if they exist, seem either unable or unwilling to provide the kind of ambiguous proof that would settle the question definitively. We're left instead with testimony, with patterns of reports that share remarkable similarities across cultures and time periods, with physiological and psychological effects that can be documented but not definitively traced to their alleged causes. It's a form of knowledge that sits uncomfortably in our current scientific paradigm, too substantial to dismiss entirely, but too ambiguous to embrace without reservation. The government's gradual acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena, the release of previously classified videos showing objects moving in ways that defy known physics, has shifted the conversation somewhat. The stigma associated with reporting UFO sightings has decreased, at least marginally. Pilots feel slightly more comfortable coming forward with their accounts. Scientists feel slightly less at risk of career suicide for expressing interest in the topic. But this progress, modest as it is, hasn't fundamentally changed the public's engagement with cases like Travis Walton's. The question remains not whether strange things are seen in our skies, that seems increasingly undeniable, but what they are, where they come from, and what their presence means for our understanding of reality and our place in the cosmos. Travis Walton's experience forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about consciousness and the nature of reality itself. If his account is accurate, then at minimum we must accept that non-human intelligence exists, has technology far beyond our current capabilities, and has both the ability and willingness to interact with human beings in ways that violate our notions of consent and autonomy. But the implications go deeper than that. The way Travis describes his experience suggests that these beings perceive and interact with reality in fundamentally different ways than we do. The telepathic communication, the manipulation of time and space, the craft that seems to respond to thought or intention rather than mechanical controls, all of this points toward a relationship between consciousness and physical reality that differs radically from our current scientific model. What if consciousness isn't merely an emergent property of complex neural networks, but a fundamental aspect of the universe itself, something that can be harnessed and directed by beings who've learned to work with it directly? What if the division we maintain between mind and matter, between subjective experience and objective reality, is itself a kind of illusion or limitation that more advanced beings have transcended? These aren't idle philosophical speculations, they're questions that arise naturally from taking Travis Walton's account seriously and following its implications to their logical conclusions. If his experience was real, if others like it are real, then our current scientific paradigm is missing something crucial about the nature of existence. The transformation Travis underwent isn't just about the specific events aboard that craft, it's about the shattering and rebuilding of his entire worldview. Before that night, he lived in a world governed by rules he understood, where causes led to predictable effects, where the universe operated according to known physical laws. After that night, he inhabited a reality where those rules were revealed as provisional, where the impossible could erupt into the ordinary without warning, where consciousness itself might be something far stranger and more expansive than he'd ever imagined. That kind of transformation is irreversible. You can't unknow what you've learned. You can't unsee what you've witnessed. The best you can do is find ways to integrate it, to build a new framework that accommodates both the ordinary world you still must navigate and the extraordinary reality you now know exists beyond its borders. The isolation of being a witness to the impossible is a theme that runs through Travis's story and echoes in the accounts of other experiencers. When you've seen something that defies explanation, something that most people will never believe without having experienced it themselves, you're cut off in a fundamental way from ordinary discourse. The gap between your reality and theirs becomes almost unbridgeable. You can describe what happened, but descriptions fail to convey the emotional and spiritual impact, the way it restructures your entire relationship to existence. This isolation can be crushing. Many experiencers report feeling more lonely after going public with their stories than they did when keeping them secret, because the rejection and ridicule from others makes the gap between their reality and consensus reality feel even wider. Travis found connection and healing through the community of experiencers, people who could look him in the eye and say with absolute conviction, "I believe you, because I've been there too." That validation, that recognition of shared reality is profoundly important for maintaining psychological stability in the face of an experience that threatens to destabilize everything. But even within that community, there are differences. Some experiencers interpret their encounters through spiritual or mystical frameworks, seeing them as initiations or awakenings. Others approach them more pragmatically, as simply unusual events that happened without deeper cosmic significance. Travis seems to fall somewhere in between. He acknowledges the profound impact the experience had on his consciousness and worldview, but he doesn't claim to have been given special knowledge or mission. He's simply a man who lived through something extraordinary and has tried, as honestly as possible, to share what that was like. The question of why these beings, whoever or whatever they are, return experiencers rather than keeping them or eliminating them is one of the more intriguing aspects of the phenomenon. If their technology is advanced enough to abduct humans undetected, surely they could dispose of witnesses just as easily. Yet, in the vast majority of reported cases, experiencers are returned, often to the exact location they were taken from or somewhere nearby. The returned individuals are usually altered in some way, carrying memories or marks or changed perspectives, but they're alive and relatively unharmed. What does this pattern suggest? That these beings operate according to ethical constraints we don't fully understand? That the purpose of the encounters isn't acquisition, but study, and returning the subjects is part of the protocol? Or perhaps that the encounters themselves are meant to have an effect on human consciousness collectively? That each experiencer becomes a kind of seed planted in human culture, gradually shifting our awareness and preparing us for eventual open contact.
Travis Walton has spent nearly 5 decades living with the aftermath of those 5 missing days. The experience has defined his life in ways both obvious and subtle. It made him a public figure, known to millions who've never met him. It connected him to a global community of people seeking answers to the same questions. But it also isolated him, marked him as different, turned his most private trauma into public property. The weight of carrying that story, of being responsible for keeping the truth alive despite skepticism and ridicule, is something most people never have to bear. Yet Travis has carried it with a kind of quiet dignity, never claiming more than he knows, never backing down from what he experienced, maintaining his story's essential details, even as decades pass and the world changes around him. The forest where it all happened remains unchanged in many ways. The trees have grown taller, the logging roads have been maintained or fallen into disrepair, but the clearing itself, the spot where Travis stood looking up at that impossible light, retains a quality that visitors often remark upon, a sense of presence, of significance, as if the place itself remembers what happened there. Travis returns to that spot periodically, not seeking answers, but simply bearing witness, maintaining connection with the ground where his life divided into before and after. He stands there in silence, letting the wind move through the pines, listening to the same sounds his ears heard that night, feeling the same earth beneath his feet. The craft is gone, has been gone for nearly 50 years, but something lingers. Not a physical presence, but an imprint, an echo in the fabric of that place. What Travis Walton's experience ultimately teaches us isn't about aliens or spaceships or government cover-ups. It's about the fragility and resilience of human consciousness when confronted with the truly other. It's about the courage required to stand in your truth when the entire world tells you you're wrong or crazy. It's about the cost of knowledge, the burden of seeing beyond the veil that keeps most people comfortable in their conventional reality. Every person who's had a genuine encounter with the unknown faces a choice. They can deny it, suppress the memory, retreat into comfortable skepticism about their own experience, or they can accept it, integrate it, and bear the consequences of living in a larger, stranger, more mysterious world than most people acknowledge. Travis chose acceptance. He chose to live with the full weight of what happened to him, to speak his truth regardless of the cost. That choice, repeated day after day for nearly 50 years, is perhaps more remarkable than the original encounter itself. The transformation that Travis underwent during those 5 days wasn't merely psychological. Something shifted at a fundamental level in how he perceived and interacted with reality. This is a common thread among experiencers, this sense of having been altered in ways that go beyond trauma or changed beliefs. They report becoming more sensitive to energies and presences others don't perceive. They describe a thinning of the boundary between waking consciousness and other states of awareness. They feel connected to something larger than themselves in a way that's difficult to articulate but impossible to deny. These changes resist conventional scientific explanation, but they're real for those who experience them. They suggest that contact with non-human intelligence doesn't just change what we know, but what we are, as if consciousness itself is more plastic and mutable than our current models of knowledge. The beings Travis encountered, both the small gray entities and the taller human-looking figures, operated according to their own logic and purposes. Trying to understand their motivations through human frameworks is probably futile. We can speculate that they were studying him, but study for what purpose? To understand human biology, human consciousness, Earth's ecosystem? Or perhaps something we lack the conceptual vocabulary to even frame as a question. The apparent clinical detachment they displayed, the lack of cruelty but also the lack of concern for his fear and confusion, suggests a mindset so different from ours that bridge building, meaningful communication might be impossible without significant evolution on both sides. They seemed neither hostile nor particularly friendly, neither evil nor angelic, just other in a way that defied simple categorization. This otherness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of encounters like Travis's. We're accustomed to categorizing things as threats or opportunities, enemies or allies. But what do you do with something that doesn't fit those categories, that seems to regard you with the same detached interest a scientist might have for a lab specimen? The lack of malice provides no comfort because it confirms that from their perspective, our suffering and consent might be irrelevant considerations. This suggests a universe where human values and concerns are provincial rather than universal, where the ethical frameworks we've developed over millennia of civilization might have no purchase or meaning beyond our own species. That's a profoundly humbling and disturbing realization. The patterns that emerge when you study multiple encounter cases are striking. Many experiencers report similar beings, similar craft interiors, similar procedures. The consistency across cultures, time periods, and individual witnesses who have no contact with each other suggests either a real phenomenon with consistent characteristics or an archetypal pattern embedded deep in human consciousness that emerges under certain conditions. The question of which explanation is correct remains open, but the patterns themselves are undeniable. People who've never read about alien abductions, who come from cultures with no UFO mythology, still report experiences that match the details of other accounts with eerie precision. Small beings with large eyes, sterile examination rooms, telepathic communication, missing time. These elements repeat with statistical significance that demands explanation. Travis Walton's case stands out not because it's unique, but because it was witnessed by multiple people and investigated extensively. The initial sighting had 7 witnesses, all of whom maintained their accounts despite intense scrutiny and personal cost. The search effort involved dozens of people combing the forest for days. The media attention was immediate and sustained. The investigation included law enforcement, psychologists, and eventually researchers from various disciplines. This level of documentation is rare in encounter cases, which typically involve isolated individuals with no corroborating witnesses. The Travis Walton case offers as close to verifiable evidence as the phenomenon typically provides, and yet it still falls short of definitive proof. The witnesses could be mistaken or lying, though the evidence suggests neither. The psychological evaluations could be flawed. The physical effects could have mundane explanations. There's always room for doubt, always an escape hatch for those committed to conventional explanations. This persistent ambiguity seems almost designed to maintain the phenomenon in a liminal space, neither definitively proven nor definitively debunked. Some researchers suggest this ambiguity is intentional, that the beings behind these encounters deliberately maintain plausible deniability, revealing themselves to select individuals while ensuring that their existence remains controversial to the broader culture. The reasoning behind such a strategy remains mysterious. Perhaps gradual revelation prevents social collapse or panic. Perhaps the beings are bound by ethical constraints that limit how directly they can intervene in human affairs. Or perhaps the ambiguity itself is the message, an invitation to expand our epistemological frameworks beyond the rigid demand for objective proof, to accept that some truths can only be known through direct experience and trust. Travis describes the moment of his return to Earth, waking on cold ground with pine needles against his skin, as simultaneously the worst and best moment of his life.
Worst, because he had no idea where he was or what had happened, because the transition from that sterile, alien environment to familiar forest was so jarring it felt like falling between worlds. Best, because he was alive, because he was back, because the ordeal, whatever it had been, was apparently over. That mixture of relief and disorientation, of gratitude and trauma, characterized his emotional state for years afterward. Part of him was grateful to have survived, to have been returned. Part of him was angry about being taken in the first place, about the violation of his autonomy, about the fear and confusion he'd been subjected to. And part of him, a part he rarely spoke about publicly, missed something about that experience. The sense of having touched something vast and important, of having glimpsed realities that most humans never encounter. This ambivalence is common among experiencers. The encounters are traumatic, violations of consent and bodily autonomy that would be criminal if committed by humans. Yet they're also transformative, opening doors of perception and possibility that remain closed for most people. Many experiencers report feeling chosen or special in some way, not from ego, but from the simple fact of having been singled out for attention by something far beyond human understanding. That feeling of significance, even when accompanied by trauma, becomes part of their identity in ways that can't be untangled. They're survivors, yes, but also witnesses, bridges between the known world and something stranger and more profound. The impact of Travis's experience on his personal relationships was significant and lasting. Some people distanced themselves, uncomfortable with his story or unwilling to be associated with someone marked by such controversy. Others drew closer, fascinated or supportive, wanting to understand what he'd been through. Romantic relationships were particularly challenging. How do you maintain intimacy with someone when you're carrying a secret so large it colors every interaction? When you wake from nightmares they can't understand? When you're constantly watching the sky with a mixture of fear and longing they'll never share? Travis's relationships had to accommodate the presence of his experience, had to make room for the ways it had changed him. Those who couldn't or wouldn't do that work eventually fell away. The nightmares that plagued Travis in the years following his return weren't simple replays of the events. They were surreal, fragmented experiences where elements of the encounter blended with symbolic imagery and emotional content. He'd dream of being back in that examination room, but the beings would have familiar faces, or the walls would breathe and pulse like living tissue. He'd dream of the forest, but the trees would be made of metal and the stars would be watching him with enormous eyes. These dreams, he came to understand, were his psyche's attempt to process and integrate what had happened, to find categories and frameworks that could contain the experience. The dreams were uncomfortable, sometimes terrifying, but they were also necessary, part of the healing process that allowed him to continue functioning in everyday reality while carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed. Over time, Travis developed a kind of peace with his experience. Not forgiveness exactly, since the beings never asked for forgiveness and probably wouldn't understand the concept in human terms, but acceptance, a recognition that what happened was real, was significant, and was now part of who he was. Fighting against it, trying to deny or minimize it, only caused more suffering. Accepting it, integrating it into his life story, allowed him to move forward. This acceptance didn't mean he stopped seeking answers or stopped caring about the truth. It meant he stopped waiting for some external validation or explanation to give his experience meaning. The meaning came from having lived through it, from the ways it had changed him, from the connections it had created with others who'd walked similar paths. The role Travis took on within the experiencer community was never one he sought, but it became crucial to his sense of purpose. By speaking publicly about his encounter, by maintaining his story despite skepticism and ridicule, he created space for others to come forward with their own accounts. His credibility, built on consistency and corroborating evidence, lent weight to the broader phenomenon. People who might have remained silent found courage in his example. Researchers who might have dismissed the topic as too fringe found in his case something worth serious investigation. He became, almost despite himself, a touchstone, a reference point that others could use to validate their own experiences or introduce the topic to skeptics.
This role came with responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming. Every retelling of his story required him to relive the trauma to some degree. Every interview, every conference appearance, every conversation with a curious stranger meant reopening wounds that never fully healed. But he continued, because he understood that his experience wasn't just his own. It belonged, in some sense, to everyone seeking to understand humanity's place in a cosmos that might be far more populated and stranger than our current paradigm acknowledges. His willingness to be vulnerable, to share not just the facts, but the emotional and spiritual impact, gave others permission to do the same. The scientific community's engagement with cases like Travis Walton's remains frustratingly limited. The phenomenon doesn't lend itself to controlled experiments or reproducible results. The evidence is largely testimonial, supported by physiological and psychological effects that can be documented but not definitively traced to their alleged causes. Without physical artifacts or repeatable observations, mainstream science has little to work with using its current methodologies. Yet the patterns are there. The consistency across multiple independent accounts, the physiological effects, the radar returns, and photographic evidence from other cases. The phenomenon, whatever it is, leaves traces. The question is whether science will develop new methodologies capable of investigating consciousness-related phenomena that don't fit neatly into materialist frameworks, or whether the study of these experiences will remain marginalized. Some researchers are pushing the boundaries, exploring quantum consciousness theories, studying the neurobiology of anomalous experiences, investigating the electromagnetic and radiation effects associated with close encounters. These efforts remain on the fringes of academic respectability, but they represent important attempts to bridge the gap between subjective experience and objective investigation. Travis has participated in many of these studies, submitting to brain scans and psychological assessments, providing blood samples and detailed timelines. He cooperates not because he needs validation for himself, but because he hopes that somewhere in all this data, patterns might emerge that move the conversation forward. The question of what these beings want, assuming Travis's experience reflects a real encounter with non-human intelligence, remains one of the great mysteries. The clinical nature of the examination suggests research or data collection, but to what end? Are they studying humanity as we might study an emerging species, documenting our development and evolution? Are they concerned about our nuclear capabilities, our environmental impact, our potential to spread beyond our planet? Or is their interest more abstract, focused on consciousness itself, on the nature of awareness as it manifests in biological organisms? Travis has no answers to these questions. The beings he encountered didn't explain themselves or their purposes. They simply did what they did, leaving him to make sense of it afterward. Some researchers propose that these encounters are part of a long-term project, a gradual acclimation process preparing humanity for eventual open contact. According to this theory, the beings maintain secrecy not to hide their existence, but to prevent panic or social collapse that might result from sudden revelation. They seed the culture with encounters, allowing awareness to spread gradually through individuals like Travis who share their experiences. Over generations, the stigma decreases, acceptance grows, and humanity collectively moves toward readiness for formal contact. This theory is speculative, impossible to prove or disprove, but it offers a framework for understanding the strange, half-revealed nature of the phenomenon. Travis's life, viewed from a distance, illustrates the cost and value of being a bearer of impossible knowledge. He's sacrificed privacy, endured ridicule, and carried trauma for decades, but he's also connected with remarkable people, participated in important conversations, and maintained his integrity in the face of enormous pressure to recant or sensationalize. His story has inspired others to speak their truth, has challenged rigid paradigms, and has kept alive questions that mainstream culture would prefer to forget.
The value of that contribution is difficult to quantify, but undeniably real. Every person who hears his story and allows it to crack open their certainty about the nature of reality is changed in some small way. Those changes accumulate, slowly shifting collective consciousness toward greater openness and humility in the face of the unknown.
The forest where Travis was taken remains a place of power and mystery. Visitors report unusual sensations, unexplained lights, equipment malfunctions. Whether these phenomena are real, products of suggestion, or manifestations of some lingering effect from the original encounter, the place has acquired significance beyond its physical characteristics. It's become a pilgrimage site of sorts, a location where the boundary between ordinary reality and something stranger feels permeable. Travis himself feels this quality when he visits. It's not that he expects the craft to return or the beings to appear again. It's that the place remembers, holds an imprint of what transpired there, and that imprint affects anyone sensitive enough to perceive it. The deeper implications of Travis Walton's experience extend far beyond the question of whether aliens exist. If his account is accurate, it suggests that consciousness is more fundamental to reality than our current scientific models acknowledge. The telepathic communication he describes, the apparent ability of the craft to respond to thought, the way time seemed to behave differently in that environment, all point toward a universe where mind and matter interact in ways we're only beginning to glimpse. Quantum physics hints at these connections, suggesting that observation affects reality at the most fundamental levels. Perhaps beings more advanced than us have learned to harness these effects, to use consciousness as a tool for manipulating space, time, and matter directly. This possibility both excites and unsettles. If consciousness can affect reality directly, if thoughts can shape outcomes beyond the confines of our skulls, then the universe is far more participatory and less mechanistic than the dominant scientific paradigm suggests. We're not just observers of a predetermined universe, but participants in an ongoing creation, our thoughts and intentions having real effects on the fabric of reality itself. For beings that have mastered this relationship between consciousness and matter, what we call miracles or impossibilities might be simple applications of understood principles. The craft that took Travis might not be a vehicle in the conventional sense, but a manifestation of consciousness, a thought given form and substance through techniques we can barely imagine. Travis often reflects on how small and provincial human concerns appear when viewed against the backdrop of his experience. The political divisions, the economic systems, the conflicts that dominate our news cycles all seem trivial when you've glimpsed the vastness of what exists beyond our immediate awareness. This isn't to say these concerns don't matter to the people experiencing them, only that they're revealed as temporary and limited when placed in cosmic context. The beings that took Travis, if they exist, probably regard human civilization the way we might regard an ant colony, interesting in its complexity but limited in its awareness, operating according to patterns it doesn't fully understand, caught in cycles of behavior that seem inevitable from inside but arbitrary from outside. This perspective could lead to nihilism, to a sense that nothing human scale matters in a universe so vast and strange. But for Travis, it led to something different, a deeper appreciation for the human experience precisely because it's limited and temporary. If we're just one species among countless others, just one brief flowering of consciousness in an ancient cosmos, then what we do with our limited time and awareness matters immensely. The kindness we show each other, the beauty we create, the truth we uphold, these things have value not despite their smallness, but because of it. In a universe of unimaginable scale and complexity, human meaning might be local and temporary, but it's real and precious for those experiencing it. The question of whether we're ready for open contact with non-human intelligence is one Travis considers carefully. His own experience suggests that individual contact is traumatic and disorienting, even for those who survive it relatively intact. Collective contact, the sudden, undeniable revelation that we're not alone in the universe, would be enormously disruptive to every human institution and belief system. Religions would have to reconcile their doctrines with the existence of other intelligent beings. Governments would face questions about their knowledge and disclosure. Economic and power structures based on terrestrial concerns would suddenly seem parochial. The psychological and social impact would be profound and unpredictable.
Yet, perhaps that disruption is necessary. Human civilization faces challenges that require expanded perspective and cooperation on unprecedented scales. Climate change, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence. These problems demand that we think beyond national borders and immediate self-interest. Contact with non-human intelligence would force that expansion of perspective, would make undeniably clear that we're all humans first, sharing a small planet in a vast cosmos. Our differences trivial compared to the gulf between us and truly other beings. If nothing else, it might catalyze the kind of species-level cooperation that currently seems impossible. Travis doesn't claim to know if or when open contact will happen. He only knows that his experience, and thousands of similar accounts, suggests the presence of something or someone already here, already interacting with humans, but doing so in ways that maintain ambiguity and deniability. Whether this is deliberate policy or inherent limitation, whether the beings are following ethical guidelines or simply pursuing their own inscrutable purposes, the effect is the same. We live in a world where contact has already happened but hasn't been acknowledged by the mainstream. We exist in a liminal state, between ignorance and knowledge, between isolation and connection, waiting for something to tip the balance one way or another. The transformation that Travis underwent isn't complete. It continues to unfold decades after the original event. Each retelling of his story brings new insights. Each conversation with other experiencers reveals new patterns. Each quiet moment in the forest connects him more deeply to the mystery at the heart of his experience. He's not the same person who stepped out of that truck on a November evening in 1975. That young logger, restless and confident, living in a world of certainty and solid boundaries, is gone. In his place is someone humbler, more open, carrying knowledge that both burdens and liberates. He knows things most people never learn, has seen things most people never encounter, and that knowledge has carved away the unnecessary and superficial, leaving something more essential. The gift of Travis Walton's experience, if it can be called a gift, is the expansion of possibility it represents. Whether you believe his account or not, engaging with it seriously requires you to consider that reality might be stranger and more mysterious than consensus understanding suggests. It invites you to hold your certainties more lightly, to allow for the possibility that consciousness is more than neural activity, that intelligence exists in forms we haven't imagined, that the universe is alive with presence and purpose rather than dead and mechanistic. These aren't comfortable thoughts. They destabilize our sense of understanding and control, but they're also liberating, opening doors that materialism closes, suggesting that existence is far more interesting and meaningful than reductive frameworks allow. In the end, Travis Walton's story is about courage, the courage to step toward the unknown despite fear, the courage to survive trauma and integrate it rather than being destroyed by it, the courage to speak truth knowing you'll be mocked and disbelieved, the courage to live with questions that have no answers, with knowledge that isolates as much as it connects. That courage, maintained over decades in the face of overwhelming pressure to recant or embellish, is perhaps more remarkable than the encounter itself. It's a model of how to hold truth when truth is costly, how to maintain integrity when abandoning it would be easier, how to live with mystery when certainty would be more comfortable. The light that struck Travis Walton in that Arizona forest in 1975 didn't just take him aboard a craft for 5 days. It illuminated something about the nature of reality, about the limits of human understanding, about the courage required to face the unknown and survive it with dignity and tact. That light continues to shine through his story.
inviting anyone willing to look beyond comfortable certainties to consider that we might be living in a far stranger, more populated, more mysterious universe than we dare to imagine. And perhaps that's the real message. Not that aliens are real, but that reality itself is far larger than our current maps describe, and that we need the humility and courage to acknowledge how little we truly know. Travis Walton, by living his truth despite everything, reminds us that the first step toward understanding is admitting ignorance, and the first step toward contact with the other is accepting that the other exists, whether or not we're ready to fully comprehend what that means.